I discovered my guest, Dr. Clay Zuba, via one of the most popular videos on his YouTube channel, titled How World War I Broke American Literature. Instead of trying to summarize it, let me just give you the opening paragraph that hooked me in. Whenever you read a work of literature that seems deliberately broken, confusing, fragmented, refusing to make coherent sense, or give a clear moral answer, that's not a flaw. It's a deliberate technique, and it's the legacy of a group of writers who saw their reality fall apart in World War I and asked, if reality is broken, if reality doesn't make coherent sense, maybe literature should be broken too. This is how modernism rewrote the rules and how those new rules of modernism still govern how we read and write today. Dr. Zuba earned his PhD from the University of Delaware with a focus on pre-Civil War American literature and how European writers represented Native American peoples. His work also crosses into visual studies, and he spent a 12-month dissertation fellowship at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, where he studied the relationship between text, image, and native representation. He has also written an unpublished manuscript that serves as a prequel to Nathaniel Hawthorne's House of Seven Gables. He has previously taught at George Mason and the University of Houston, and now teaches at the University of Arizona. In this tour, we talk about Hawthorne, as well as Melville, Twain, T.S. Eliot, Camus, Conrad, Cooper, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, Frederick Douglass, and even Fox's Book of Martyrs. We get into the Salem witch trials, Indian captivity narratives, the Boston Tea Party, Manifest Destiny, the quote Vanishing Indian, the invention of the American novel, Gothic fiction, sentimental novels, unreliable narrators, and the rise of modernism, and even dystopian fiction like Fahrenheit 451. By the end of this tour, you'll feel like you have a much better understanding of the wide variety of literature that existed prior to the Civil War, including many works, authors, and genres you were never taught about in your high school classes or college courses. Before we jump in, just a quick note that there's some bonus resources that go along with this bookshelf tour in the first link in the description. The first bonus is a shared folder where you can download all the high-resolution photos of Dr. Zuba's library. You'll also get a resources spreadsheet, which gives you links to where you can find some of the key books and other resources we talked about in this video. You'll also get my classics resources spreadsheet, which collects in one place all the key details for the major facing page translation book sets, like the Loeb Classical Library and other similar sets from Harvard University Press, as well as other publishers of facing page translation libraries. You'll also get a free book where I gathered all the best advice about how to manage your library and how to improve your reading from the 55 plus hours of bookshelf tours I've conducted over the past couple of years. Just click the first link in the description to get all of these free bonus resources. Also, if you'd like to do a bookshelf tour with me, please email timothy@timothykenny.com. Lastly, a big thank you to all of my students for your continued support that makes these long-form bookshelf tours possible. There's one course and one program that I teach that may interest you and are most relevant to the subjects we cover in this tour. The first item is my self-directed learner course, which will help you build all the skills required to pursue lifelong education through all the key steps like learning project organization, skill investing, research, reading and annotating, note-taking, memorizing, and putting your learning into action directly or through a program of deliberate practice. Please click the second link in the description for more on the self-directed learner course. The second item is the Renaissance program, my guide to building an encyclopedic mind through the classics, the great books, and the best of modern knowledge. We live in a world that rewards specialization, so it can feel almost impossible to recover the kind of broad, well-rounded education earlier eras took for granted. This program gives you a lifelong framework for organizing your learning across history, geography, ideas, facts, literature, human nature, society, and the transcendent, so you can understand the major branches of knowledge, see how they fit together, and develop unique creative insights that are only possible with this kind of broad base of learning. Please click the third link in the description to learn more about the Renaissance program. If you'd like to learn about my other courses, programs, and learning tracks, and how you can support the production of these bookshelf tours, please click the fourth link in the description where you can view my complete course catalog. And now let's get into the bookshelf tour with Dr. Clay Zuba. Okay, so Dr. Zuba, thanks a lot for doing this, sharing your library with us. And I thought we would get started by just talking a little bit about how you've organized your books here.
Thanks, Tim. I'm happy to be here. I'm a little bit when you asked me at first even to be on your channel,
Yeah.
I felt a little bit embarrassed by one thing, by several things, of course. You're always embarrassed when you're gonna have to be on somebody's YouTube channel. But one of the most embarrassing things to me is the fact that my shelves are not really organized, or not really organized the way many of your guests' shelves are organized. I've seen some of your guests organizing by color, some by theme. Mine don't have a great organizational strategy. I think that the last time I organized these books would have been like 4 years ago. And whenever I move, they end up kind of just being thrown on the shelves. And I did have a little bit of a strategy in the sense that some of these books, like these ones we're looking at just a second ago, are meant to be backdrops for my YouTube channel videos, and same with that other tall shelf, and same with this shelf. The shelf you're looking at right now is, yeah, that's one of the main ones. I'm sitting behind that right now. So I think I just threw some books up there that I thought would look interesting to people. And, the ones below on the bottom 2 shelves are those are a little bit more organized. They're at least organized alphabetically.
I thought it might be, I was going to also ask you about a little bit about your academic background, but um, I just wanted to maybe recommend people go a video that people can go watch on your channel. I believe the video that originally led me to your channel is one of your most popular. It's called
It
"How
was.
World War One Broke American Literature: Modernism Explained, 1913 to 1945." And I just thought you did an excellent job explaining things in a perspective that I wasn't hugely familiar with, and that led me down a research rabbit hole of learning about other stuff like that. And so, yeah, if you want to say a few words about that video, and we'll put a link to that down in the comments. But that, and then if you could tell us a little bit about your academic background and interests.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your compliment, and I'm really glad, that you kind of could have found that video informative, and that it also, generated some curiosity for you about the literary period in general. I'm a professor of early American literature, and, my specialty was probably, pre-Civil War US literature, but, a lot of my favorite stuff is from the 1920s, in the 1950s. I got my PhD from Delaware in 2016. I focused on studying the way that the representation of Native Americans by European peoples were used to generate stories and ideas about their own European identities that kind of ended up justifying their own imperial ambitions. And I also studied the way that text and image work together in many of these early American works. So there's some overlap you see in my library with visual studies. I actually had a 12-month dissertation fellowship at Smithsonian American Art. So you'll see kind of a wide mix of stuff. I've got a lot of stuff that's like literary theory. I've got a lot of historical stuff because I studied the earlier periods of American literature, and of course, I've got a lot of fiction. And some of these books, like, I just picked up recently, like, and they're more aspirational, some of these in terms of reading, like, I've got The Social Contract in French. I don't read French, but I thought maybe one day, or maybe it could help me learn to read French. Like the editions that appear for many of these works are also interesting to me. Like you probably noticed when you looked at my shelves, I've got like 6 editions of House of the Seven Gables and like 5 editions of The Scarlet Letter and like 7 editions of The Great Gatsby, one of those in French. And books themselves are interesting to me in the way that they're packaging ideas for people and the way that the package of the idea kind of mediates the experience of the text then for people. While we were up for a second, I picked up 2 of the Scarlet Letter books I thought were interesting that showed the why I have so many editions of things. This is one edition of the Scarlet Letter, a more scholarly Bedford edition, and this is a different edition of the Scarlet Letter. I probably don't need to explain to you in great detail the way that these two like set up very different expectations for the reader in terms of what they're going to read.
Could we take a quick look at the spine and the back of both of those?
Yeah,
So the blue
I have to
one,
pull them steady. Sorry.
yeah, the blue one looks like you'd pick it up at the pharmacy or the supermarket.
Yeah, it looks like kind of a YA kind of
Mm.
version. Is it by Tor? Tor is they usually publish science fiction. So that's kind of interesting. It does have that kind of fantasy vibe to it a little bit. And the other one, that's really hard to read, sorry, but that's a Bedford edition. That's a more scholarly edition of the book.
Can we look at the back
Yeah,
quickly? I know people be interested in.
sure. Oh, oh, that's the wrong way. Sorry. So one of these is also showing the scholarly works that are in it, like secondary materials that are meant to help the reader understand the book in terms of either like literary criticism or in terms of historicizing it. And the other one is more like a plot teaser.
Could you show the Bedford one a little bit closer because the text you can't quite read it. Yeah,
Yeah.
the bullet points especially. I think that's what you were talking about with the different commentaries. Yeah, that's good. That's in focus now.
Yeah.
Nice.
I can see now. I couldn't see before. It's kind of putting it in terms of like it's surrounding it with other like legendary American texts, whereas this other one makes no attempt to situate it as kind of an American classic.
And is that your interest, situating stuff or comparing, looking at the contemporaries of the author?
Yeah, I would say so because I'm interested in the way that images are circulating with texts. So these are 2 books that have actually like pretty much exactly the same text, but by having different images, the different images frame the text differently for the reader, creating different expectations and probably creating like a kind of lens that the reader will kind of read it through. Like this tour version is gonna read it more like a story of maybe, growing up or maybe a story of romance, but this other one is setting it up is more a lot like about, more like Puritan motherhood kind of things, kind of a different motherhood vibe in these 2 works.
Okay, well, I'll go back to the photo here, and there's another House of Seven Gables, or a couple of them there.
Yeah,
Um,
I did a lot of work in thinking about House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne because of the way he sets up his story. He sets it up in olden Puritan times, and it's a story about a man who's he's accused of witchcraft by a really wealthy governor of the story who really just wants to take his land. And there's a curse set up in that novel then by that original act. And all the descendants of the person who took the land are under this curse through the rest of the story. And there's a way that that kind of feels a lot like the American story in terms of the United States founding itself and taking land under false pretenses and denying that it ever happened. You'll see that shelf has a lot of my critical things. Cadillac Desert actually is not a critical thing. I bought that at the recommendation of one of my friends when I moved to Phoenix, Arizona, so I could understand water. Because he asked me, where does your water come from? And I said, I didn't know. And he said, how can you not know where your water comes from? You have to know where your water comes from, where you live, so you know what kinds of water problems you might have in the future. So yeah, I would recommend that book for sure to anybody who's living out here in the West and interested in water. Some of these books I've had for a very long time. That Absalom book, have had that since I was in college. That was a book about one of my I think that's my favorite William Faulkner novel by my favorite professor, Robert Dale Parker, who I had in 1994 at the University of Illinois. And Mythologies, Roland Barthes, extremely important piece of post-structural criticism.
You also got Bart over here.
Yeah,
I was thinking we usually just go in order. I know I was kind of jumping around. There's
I
another
know.
Bart. I was just going to ask, if you don't mind me asking, where are
No,
you originally from? And did you, before you landed in Arizona?
I'm originally from Illinois. I grew up in the Chicago suburbs in a town called Crystal Lake, which is like halfway to Wisconsin. Uh, After I got my undergrad in Illinois, I moved to Austin, Texas for about 15 years.
Oh, wow.
And I had a career in mortgage finance, an unexpected career in mortgage finance that kept me from going back to graduate school for quite a while. But eventually I did go. So then I moved to Houston to get my master's. And finally, I moved to the East Coast to get my PhD in Delaware. Then I moved to Washington, D.C. when I was studying at Smithsonian. And finally, my wife and I moved back out west.
Could you talk a little bit about that time at the Smithsonian? Because that sounds really interesting.
Oh, it was very cool. They offer fellowships to, I think they give like 15 fellowships to people in graduate school. And because a lot of my work was studying kind of an intersection between visual and textual studies, I felt really fortunate, actually. I was the first person in a literature program to get a fellowship from Smithsonian American Art. I don't know if they have since then, but I was fortunate to work with Bill Trutner, the late Bill Trutner over there. He did a lot of studies about the way that American painters in their representations of Native peoples set up imperial ideas about Native Americans for the European people who were viewing them, and the way they kind of circulated ideas of American imperial ambitions by showing Native peoples as savage and inferior and needing to be saved. And the only way they could be saved, really, though, for a lot of these painters was to paint them, because the assumption was that they were doomed to perish from the earth. That's the standard 19th century myth of the vanishing Indian that was prevalent at the time. Um, I had it was so cool. I had a cubicle there. I had access to all their library materials, and any day I wanted to, I could go look at paintings and sculptures.
Well,
It was great.
do you want to say a few words about the ACLU? Because I saw that here as well.
Um, you know, I'll admit I support the ACLU. I think they're trying to help us and keep a lot of our constitutional rights. I've supported them for probably like 20 years. I know that when I was in high school, like supporting the ACLU was something that like maybe a deviant would do. I don't know. That was like the reputation then in the 1980s. And I feel like we've maybe gone a little bit like to that now in some people's eyes. But
Yep.
they're trying to do legal work to try to help the United States and curb executive power and support individual rights. And that's something that I think is deeply American. I think that everyone should support that.
Yeah. Agreed. Okay. So, are there any, so I saw this one, How to Interpret Literature. Do you have any
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
that book was really that's a very good book. Again, Robert Dale Parker, my one of my favorite professors, University of Illinois. Uh, he's That's kind of like a book that he wrote to help teach literary criticism for undergraduate students. So it goes through many different types of criticism, from Marxist criticism, post-structuralism, then in feminism, things like that. It's a really good book for anybody trying to understand different types of literary theory and why it's important and how it can be used and the different kind of lenses that we could study literature through.
Have you done work on Walden or
Walden,
Transcendental?
I haven't done scholarly work on Walden. And when I was younger, I didn't like it at all. But as I've gotten older, I appreciate it more and more for its both the way it's written. I feel like many of these early 19th century writers and essayists were writing in a way that is kind of lost to us, in the way that they're able to almost effortlessly write long kind of parallel sentences that are full of irony and make arguments through analogy and things like that. Um, I got more interested when when I was teaching it more. And Thoreau was writing in a time when he and his society were experiencing really great changes in technology. He was writing, in the 1850s. So you got the railroad, the Industrial Revolution, and I don't know. It kind of makes me think about the way when I try to think about Thoreau now, I kind of think about the way I feel right now, in the way many people my age feel right now, with the way that when I look at my students and I see the way that their lives are so much different than mine, and it scares me the way that they're using artificial intelligence in the way that the algorithm seems to control their day. And he was anxious about the ways that technology was changing us and limiting our lives, and I think that's the way I feel sometimes too. So I have both a like an academic and scholarly appreciation for him, but I can also I feel like I can relate the older I get.
I noticed the backing to this bookcase has a pretty interesting pattern to it, and just the fact that air can flow through. Was there any rhyme or reason to that, or just how it came?
Yeah, you know what? I don't know. It's just how it came. I bought this bookshelf. I bought it when I was going to Delaware. We lived in a town called Havre de Grace, Maryland, which is on the Chesapeake Bay. And there's this guy named Fritz who had a big workshop there. And on one side, he was like a Goodwill and used things. And he also built like cheap bookshelves and tables and things in the basement. And that it really is a nice feature. I've been very happy with this bookshelf and never noticed it, but thank you.
What about this Splendid in the Vial?
It's kind of a mix of biography and literary analysis. It's of course about Winston Churchill and the way that he used his speeches and his rhetorical skills to try to unify Great Britain during the Second World War, to try to keep kind of like morale up the whole time during the siege of Britain in the Blitzkrieg. And it focuses a lot on some political aspects of it, like what was going on inside his cabinet, but it's also interesting just for his speech writing and the way he developed his speeches and the way he arranged his words to try to persuade and inspire people.
Could you say a few words about the Caste book?
Oh, yeah. That's a really interesting book. It's one of the more recent ones I've got, and it's trying to look at structures of American society through this kind of unifying idea of caste. So when we think about ways that society is structured in a way that people are kind of people in lower classes are kind of oppressed and controlled by people in upper classes. We a lot of times we think about race, and a lot of times we think about class. But this is trying to use caste as kind of a unifying principle to try to think about these things like all at once. And it's a really interesting book. It makes sense to me. It helps me understand books like The Great Gatsby, which I've been making some videos on in that one, because it's all about the upper classes, but there's still a case. There's still a difference between Jay Gatsby's character and the ultra rich like the Buchanans. Even though even though racially they're the same, and in terms of having the same amount of money, they're the same. There's still like a social difference that's impossible for Jay Gatsby to overcome.
Hmm. You've got a couple verso books here.
Yeah, those are two of the most important books I read when I started my PhD program. Imagine Communities is a kind of a foundational study in the way that early nationalisms were formed through print culture during like the the 16th and 17th centuries. It was focused on the idea that print culture allowed people who were reading all the same language to form an identity as a nation.
Hmm.
Because before that, people without print, people were maybe telling different stories, but through print, through people reading their own language, they could read like the same thing about themselves at all the same time and imagine themselves as being the same, even if they lived in very different parts of an area. And Race, Nation, Class, that's another book I read early on my graduate studies, just thinking about the intersection of race and nation and class in informing communal identities.
And then you've got the Inconvenient Indian here.
Yeah, really interesting book about trying to, I guess, debunk myths or stereotypes we have about Native American peoples, beginning, of course, with the Columbus myth. That's a good book. I've used that in teaching before. Orientalism was, I think I read that at Houston. That was one of the earliest books I read that helped me really understand Foucault's idea of a discourse, because Said, he really methodically goes through a lot of different literary books and popular books and newspaper types of reading, and he shows the way that the same kinds of phrases and descriptions are being used about the Orient in a lot of British literature, and it helped me see the way that see how language kind of accumulates, and it almost becomes impossible to talk about areas of the country or areas of the world without repeating these same kind of phrases. And a lot of times, these same kind of phrases are building like an identity of ourselves that justifies our going to war with those people or colonizing people or distrusting those people, and kind of showing those people is weak, like the way that Native American peoples were portrayed as savage consistently in early American literature. And I guess Said would point out the way now, like in our discourse about Iran, there's a repetition of the idea of the radical cleric or the crazy Muslim. These are ultimately like kind of well, they're not super constructive ways to represent other people. They're not ways of representing other people that makes us want to try to find ways to understand them better. They are ways of thinking about that that instead like close us off to them and make us maybe not want to deal with them in any constructive way.
So you've got a number of books by Barthes, and I thought maybe you could just say a little bit about him and his work and how it's influenced you when you're thinking.
I think that the most important book of the ones I have was would be Mythologies. Um, I've been interested in mythologies, well, for quite a long time. I think since I was a child. You know, that when I was thinking about them as more of a child, I would have been thinking of like Greek or Roman myths. As I got older, I read ideas by like Carl Jung, who was interested in the idea of mythology from a different perspective. He was thinking of myths as ideas about ourselves and culture in the world that were like deeply embedded in our psyches. And what was important for me in reading Barth is that he kind of moved this idea of mythology out of the self, and was studying the way that it was like a system of thinking about the world that was there on the page that people read, and that's where they got these mythologies. And then in turn, they would write them again. So it's about the circulation of mythologies on the page. It's more studying the way that the stories about, like, the way that the stories we tell about ourselves and the way that they're transmitted shape our identities. So I guess an undercurrent you're seeing is that I'm really interested in the way that the stories we tell about ourselves and the way that in the stories we tell about others kind of determine the way we think about ourselves and the way we think about others. These glossaries, the critical terms, they're kind of more recent, and I just got them because the more I've taught and the more I've thought about literature, it just helps me understand literature because it gives me like words to think about literature in. If we can identify the ways that people write, we can identify the ways that their work is persuasive.
Mhm. And do you have, I mean, we've seen a couple at least Bedford works now. Do you particularly like how they put stuff together? Or is that just coincidence?
I think that Bedford and Norton are the two publishers who publish stuff for undergraduate schools or for graduate school, I guess for more academic study. So I have a tendency to get copies of their stuff just because they're usually packaged in a way that has forewords or introductions or other supplementary materials that help me understand the book from different perspectives, either from a historical perspective or from a perspective about like the way that it's trying to help me studying it.
Um,
You see, that's another one of my House of the Seven Gables. That's the Ohio State University Press authoritative edition of the House of the Seven Gables. Um, That one I got, just because, I was really studying Nathaniel Hawthorne for quite a long time, and, it's just a clean copy that's good to read, and you can see yeah, I was talking about different types. I've got that by I think it's a Norton critical edition of The House of the Seven Gables.
and then you've got some more Hawthorne here in the Library of America.
Yeah, I like those editions because, they're pretty cheap. Like, they're not cheap individually, but they're good value. Like, each of them has, like, 5 or 6 novels on of them, and they're always set from the most authoritative editorial editions. So, there's a certain amount of duplication, I guess, in my library. So, like, in Hawthorne's collective novels, that would contain the text of the centenary edition of The House of the Seven Gables. Even though the separate books, they would have exactly the same text.
Maybe we could talk about this one next because it's also vertical. The regeneration through violence.
Yeah, I think that's one of the earliest books I got when I was going back to graduate school. Uh, Really interesting book. Richard Slotkin was studying the way that colonists and later Americans were representing Native peoples, and his premise is kind of there in the title. It's that America kind of needs to regenerate itself periodically through violence, and it traces this idea to some of the earliest writing in the colonies through the earliest American genre, which was the Indian captivity narrative. It told the story of white women being captured by savage Native Americans, and well, in a captivity narrative, the white woman is always returned, but it leaves at the end of it a call for vengeance, usually, that the white woman was threatened, and the white woman actually becomes like a symbol for the nation. So it ends up creating kind of like a paradox, like the national body is portrayed as a white woman, and the only way to save the white woman is through violence, usually against non-white others.
There's a
Um,
famous painting.
yeah.
Do you know the one I'm thinking of where I don't know if it's Lady Liberty or what it is, but she's like holding something up.
Um, Not sure.
Okay.
Not sure. The one I think of usually is called The Death of Jane McCrea by John Vanderlyn, and that's got two native peoples towering over and getting ready to slaughter a white woman. And the one of the reasons I love that one is just because the skin colors are so stark, and the white woman, her bosom is like so exposed. It's almost like sexualized. Like there's a worry that she's going to be violated in several in more than one way. And there's then her husband is kind of like way in the back, and so you can see the masculine white person coming to save her, but you also know it's kind of going to be too late. So there's a real emotion being created there in the desire to protect this woman, but also a feeling like it almost like anticipates the vengeance that's going to have to happen while she's alive, because you can tell that she's not going to be alive very long.
Hmm. So, um, are there any other ones here that particularly stand out for you?
Um, I think we've talked about most of these, or most of the ideas behind these. Richter's Facing East from Indian Country is a book for anybody who's interested in some of these ideas that I've been talking about. Uh, his is a study. Usually, a lot of what I've been talking about so far is white people writing about Native American peoples, but a lot of my library is also Native peoples speaking back against the ideas that the white people were promulgating about Native peoples. So this book, Facing East from Indian Country, is kind of trying to show a different perspective, because usually we're looking west into Indian country. So in this case, it's about as trying to understand indigenous peoples like more on their own terms, and to kind of look at some of the stories that we tell about Native peoples from a more indigenous perspective. Removable Type was a really important book in my studies about Native American printers in the early American Republic, the ways that they were using printed typeface to help work for their sovereignty, in the same ways that European peoples were using printed works to kind of extinguish them, or limit their agency, or many times actually like justify genocide toward them.
Well, I have a bookshelf tour coming up pretty soon, already recorded with a polyglot who studies several different indigenous languages in the US and Americas and in Mexico as well. And we talked about developing the development of orthographies for those languages. And he has a whole book collection of several different languages. So I'll put that in the description for those of you who want to check that out. And I can tell you more about that after we finish recording if you want to. Um, but that looks like an
Yeah,
interesting
that's
one.
amazing. I mean, that's a very important work that he's doing.
So, what about Foucault here? Is this your only work of Foucault, or is there?
No, I
Um,
think that's the only one
okay,
here. I've got the archaeology of knowledge, but it might be at school. But that's a book of well, a lot of these books of Foucault's are collections of speeches that he gave rather than essays he wrote. But this is a collection of speeches that he gave about nationalism, and the way that the way that one of the most important narratives of the nation is the idea that society has to be defended from some outside force. And we use these stories it's like we have to unify ourselves in contrast to something else or someone else. And a lot of times, society has to be defended from an outside force. That's how a lot of times we get imperial building projects. That's how we justify war sometimes. Like there's an idea that that is prevalent in both the Indian captivity narrative and our common stories about Iran, that if we don't attack these people now, we're going to end up being a hostage to them later. And these ideas, they do justify certain actions toward these people, but they also are necessary to try to create ideas that hold our society together and keep us thinking about ourselves as one people. And it's kind of interesting now though, because the way that our societies are divided, like um, it like like Republicans kind of feel like they have to, the society has to be defended from Democrats, and Democrats feel that society has to be from Republicans. So um, I think that points to the way that our society is becoming, increasingly polarized.
You've got Race and Manifest Destiny here, and I actually found the painting that I was mentioning earlier. I'll uh, I'll hold it up to see if maybe it'll focus.
Oh yeah, I have seen that one. I haven't studied that one though.
So that's John Gast, Gast, 1872 painting, American Progress, closely identified with the 19th century concept of manifest destiny.
Yeah, there's a great tradition of American wars and American expansion and American like pursuing our national interests being justified and actually demanded by God. So that's one of the stories that was prominent in the 19th century. The idea that God had demanded that the United States fully colonize the North America. And it sets up an idea that not only authorizes the actions, but actually demands them, and implies that if we don't successfully colonize North America, then we'd be letting down God.
Mhm.
And of course, nobody wants to do that.
What about this I Am the Grand Canyon?
That's a book that is written from an indigenous perspective, tales about the Grand Canyon and the way that it was important for the indigenous people in that area historically. And I bought that when I moved to Arizona, like 8 years ago, and because of course the Grand Canyon is so important to Arizona. And, I have been fortunate enough to hike it since I've been here. I hope to do it again. It's quite an experience.
You've got these two books here. Do you want to say anything about them?
Um, the Trutner book, I think I mentioned already. I worked with him when I was at Smithsonian American Art, and it's a book about the way that, paintings of Indians in the 19th century were stimulating American ideas of itself as an empire and spurring expansion. The Calloway book is quite a different book. It's more of a straight history book than like a book about cultural production, the way many about my books are. And that is showing the roles of indigenous peoples in the American Revolution. And it's really interesting to the extent that it's kind of just basically a really messy story. Like if we think about the role of English people or French people or colonial people in the American Revolution, even though we kind of oversimplify that too, just because of the way that colonial people were divided between loyalists and independence-seeking people, but, indigenous peoples were, like, we tend to think of them as, like, whether they were an ally of the British or whether they were an ally of the American people, but instead, this is meant to help think of them as pursuing, like, many of their own interests in the war through alliances with either the British or the Americans, instead of, like, their only purpose being really to support one or the other.
This is a famous book by Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism.
Yes, super famous. I only got that one recently. I think I told you before we started taping that my books are a mix of ones that I've read and haven't read, and this is one I haven't read. But just like I found when I first got the Edward Said, I knew that was going to be a really important book, that it was going to be a challenging read. I think that'll be the same for this one. This one has this was a 3-part series, and it's got all 3 parts in it. It's going to be a really ambitious and dense read, but I think a really important one too.
This Jefferson's Empire one looks good.
Yeah, that one, the title kind of does catch a lot of what we're thinking about, but the way that Thomas Jefferson viewed early America, and the way that his writings were thinking about America in terms of an empire. Uh, there's just there's a sensitivity about when we write about early America. There's a sensitivity where like when we think about these founders, they have to be revered. And if we think of them in terms of nation building, like somehow that is hallowed and holy, but when we think of them as empire builders, then for some reason that it kind of puts more of a stigma on them or exposes them in some way. But that book and many of the other books I've got are trying to think about empire and nation as coexisting in this early time period, and the way that writers are using language to describe it.
And then Playing Indian.
Yeah, so Playing Indian, a book about the way that white people in especially the 19th century were it kind of that one is more, I think, specifically about the idea like of dressing as an Indian, and the way that there's a move toward like indigenization for the white people who are doing it. So there's kind of a tension. This goes back to the idea of a Creole. The Creole was the idea of the colonists created by the European, that they were somehow less than a European, like through their connections with Native peoples and African American peoples, they had become corrupted and less perfectly white and civilized. But one of the interesting things that happens like before and after the revolution is that the Americans kind of embrace this idea of themselves as partly Indian, and because they need to try to build their own cultural identity that's different from Europeans. So it's kind of about the cultural work that Playing Indian, like dressing up as Indian, as pretending you're an Indian, does for white people.
I guess when I saw that, a couple things came to mind just in terms of sports,
Yeah.
like with sports logos, and there's been some controversies around those, and it seems like some teams have changed, some haven't. There's also the game that sort of seems like it may be, I don't have exact dates for it, but the game of Cowboys and Indians is a childhood game. Um, that was before my time, but I don't know how far back when that started to fade out, maybe post World War II and the decades after that.
I played it
Um,
when I was a child in the '70s.
okay.
So yeah, you're right.
Maybe
You
around the
don't usually see
90s.
people playing it now, but
And you
yeah,
don't see it
it was a
depicted
thing.
in TV shows when I was growing up in the 90s, for example. So
Yeah.
it would have had to been, I guess, maybe the 70s or 80s.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's interesting in that game, like they are enemies, but like to be the Indian, like sometimes a lot of people still wanted to be the Indian.
Mhm.
There's a tension here, like the European and the American and the Indian in terms of like ideas about identity, like they kind of work together. There's not like a clean binary. It's like the idea of who we are as an American, it shifts between closer to Europeanness or closer to Indianness, depending on the story we want to tell.
There's also a lot of military helicopters are named after uh, Indian tribes.
Yeah.
You
There's
have the
that.
Chinook and the Apache and some other
Mhm.
ones.
There's street names. There's things like that. I think this does come from a big attempt in early America to try to distinguish ourselves from being European and more English. Because when we try to decolonize, we didn't have the same kinds of differences that many other societies had when they tried to decolonize, because we spoke the same language, because we were never something before, you know? Uh, so we were also very anxious and felt inferior because they had Shakespeare and we didn't have a history of our own.
We had
So
Mark
we
Twain.
kind of mythologized it by creating this idea that we were somehow connected to the Native American people at the same time that we were destroying them.
Have you done any work with Mark Twain's oeuvre?
I haven't done any scholarly work with him. I've read, of course, I've read several of his stuff. I think he is really, like not in vogue right now. But like, there's no question that he is one of the most important American writers of the 19th century. And just in terms of pure like literary craft, it's like totally amazing. And, I think that, uh, his intentions were, like, good. He was trying to criticize American society, and he was trying to criticize American racism. It's just that he was, like, much, much less evolved, like, ethically and in terms of, like, self-awareness of how, racist his ideas, like, still were. So I feel like in Huckleberry Finn, like, he was trying to write what I think we would call an anti-racist novel. It's just that it failed because he couldn't break through of the own racist stereotypes that, kind of he wasn't aware of. Were still stereotypes and that he was using.
Mhm. What about Dark Vanishings here?
That book is, kind of a lot of the stuff that I have is focused, all on the ways that Native peoples are being represented. This one kinda does a crossover, because it's thinking about Native peoples on one hand, but it also, as it moves forward in time and history, it's thinking about, the way that African people were represented by Europeans, like, in terms of, colonization. And, vanishings, goes with this idea of the vanishing Indian or the idea that African people were going to vanish. And, when you say vanish, it's like kind of like a thing that just happens. It isn't something that is caused by somebody else necessarily. It's something that is portrayed as being natural, like the idea, common in like eugenics and things like that. That we have a lot of these same fears today. That like the 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 darker races, the colored peoples, that they have to make way for the white races because the white races are superior to the darker races, and the white people are under threat everywhere by the dark races, uh, not because they're stronger than us or anything, but just because, like, on a cultural level, they can corrupt us.
Hmm. How has Latour influenced your thinking?
Uh, Latour's interesting for the way that he describes like, ideas circulating. This isn't something he talks about in Down to Earth, but the most important Latour thing I read was, he was writing about the ways that ideas of the New World spread. And the way that they become, like, increasingly detached from the real experience of people. Because, like like, this is oversimplifying his argument, but he's thinking about, like, say the way an explorer goes to one place and writes about that one place. He'll then carry those ideas back to the metropole, but the people there then don't have the experience that he had at all. All they have is the experience of reading him. And in
I
turn,
think a lot
then
of people aren't
people,
going to be familiar
yeah.
with that term metropole.
Oh, it's the idea of like the metropole is like the seat of the colony. So like in European terms, like the metropole might have been like Great Britain for the colonies, or it might have been like Paris for Paris's African colonies. But it's about the ways that the people in the metropole, like they wouldn't ever have any direct experience of the colonies. They would only be able to read what uh what the people who had gone there had written about it. And in turn, though, then people would write more things based on what they had read, but we wouldn't be getting more experiences of the metropole. We just be getting more ideas that are grounded in the original writings about it, of the colonial area. I got confused, sorry.
That term is still used today. The metropole
Yeah, I would say it
and
is.
periphery, world systems theory. I put into AI. I um I know R.W. Connell uses that, and Southern theory, and um that's what it made me think of.
Yeah, and I would say we still have a metropole now because, like, when I think about, like, the US and Iran right now, like, we're in a metropole in a way. Most of us right now will never experience Iran. We'll only read about it from the safety of our metropole. But what we think about it, what we think about Iran will have an enormous impact on what our policies are there. But it's just kind of a strange thing. There's a big disconnect because most of us won't experience it. We'll only experience it through the cultural production that we consume.
There's an interesting op-ed in the Financial Times a couple days, I think over the weekend, about Dubai and how it's sort of at the center of the East and West. It's sort of like a crossroads, and the
Yeah.
fact that it's been getting attacked recently is kind of um, that's why it was. I think the op-ed happened over the weekend, but um, Dubai isn't really a metropole, but it's definitely something. It's kind of maybe crossroads is the best word for it.
Yeah, I agree. Dubai does seem like something strange. Like something strange, like not like strange like foreign or other, but just something like historically anomalous
Yeah.
that we don't get a lot in history. It's kind of a new thing almost.
You've got this pedagogy journal here that's kind of unusual.
Yeah, so that book and The Community Without Consent that's next to it, are different because those are things that I have published articles in.
Oh, cool.
Uh, so they're the only ones on my shelf that I did publish in some other journals. I just don't happen to have hard copies of them. But Community Without Consent, that was a collection, obviously, of stuff about the Stamp Act, which was enacted in 1764, that was placing a tax on the United States, or they was in the United States, but on the colonies, that is viewed kind of as being like one of the first things that starts to make the colonists think of themselves as having a collective identity, because it was placed on all of them and they universally abhorred it. And my work in there was about the way that colonial prints that used the figure of a Native American to represent the American colonies were kind of creating they were being used as kind of an act of resistance, which is one of those first examples of the colonies kind of like playing Indian, because the British had developed that symbolism to identify them as Native Americans in order to show them as inferior. But the colonists then, because in the whole language of political cartoons, it had already been established that they were the Indian. They then kind of had to use the Indian in order to communicate on that same level, on that same political level. So there's kind of a real tension there in the ways that the Indian is portrayed as something that's inferior. He's portrayed as kind of naked, as having all savage clothing, having savage weapons. But there's a tension there in the way that then the colonial prince. They're trying to represent him at the same time as being able to contest and rightly contest imperial power. And the pedagogy article was it was about a course I taught at the University of Delaware about the idea of monstrousness, and it was a really course. It was a course that I really enjoyed teaching. It studied things like "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep" by Philip K. Dick, and The Island of Dr. Moreau, and the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde story,
Oh,
and the
wow.
ways that
Frankenstein?
you know what? Yes, Frankenstein. Yeah. Yeah, but
That's
it
really
was
cool.
about a way to use those kinds of stories in the classroom.
That's really cool. Because you're kind of connecting two different eras of looking at the monster.
Yeah, I'd say quite different. You're right. Yeah. I guess that's definitely I guess you'd call it a through line.
I was also going to say the Boston Tea Party. I mean, being from Boston myself, that's kind of
Yeah.
imprinted in our memory.
So those people were doing what Philip Deloria would describe as playing Indian. They were they dressed up as Indians, and like there wasn't really probably any pretense that they really thought the British would think it was Native Americans who were destroying the tea. They were doing it to send a message and to create a different identity for themselves.
So, uh, what about the rest of these books? Are there any in particular that stand out?
Yeah, A Strange Likeness to me is that was a book that taught me a great deal about the ways that in the earliest encounters between uh, colonial people and Native Americans, we didn't have the same kinds of ideas of difference that we had later in the period. In fact, they found ways to view themselves as similar to one another. It's it's like a I don't know, it reminds me that it didn't like, it was not inevitable that we created ideas of difference between ourselves, and when I say we, I mean, like, we people of, like, European ancestry, um, and other peoples, like, it was a culturally constructed thing. It wasn't something that we always had.
Could you say a few words about this one, The Dominion of War?
Yeah, that's a really cool book that I read early in my graduate school, and it was tracing American history through like the major wars that we've had, in the way that the major wars we've had were kind of pivotal moments in the ways that we were constructing our own identity and our ideas about ourselves.
Could you say a quick word about this one also? And I'm not able to read this.
It's called The Common Pot: The Recovery of Native Space in the Northeast.
Okay.
And that's a book about well, indigenous peoples in the Northeast. So from your area of the country,
Mhm.
in the 17th century, mostly, and the ways that they used geography and metaphors in order to build ideas about their own communities. And, that one, besides being just really interesting itself from a historical perspective, and, it was interesting to me because one of the, prints I study in my dissertation is it's actually it's a satire. It's got, it's got, figures that are used to represent all the great European empires pissing into a pot. And the one that is representing the United States is, or the colonies, is actually an Indian. But I made an argument there that this pot that these people are all pissing in is kind of having a kind of a similar function to this idea of the common pot in the Lisa Brooks study. Um, One of the things that I'm interested in a lot of other people who are studying early American literature and early American history are trying to think about the ways that native ideas were influencing European ideas, and I think there's a connection there in the ways that that pot in that print is being used to develop commonality, and the ways that the indigenous peoples were viewing the pot in this book. Like, by being able to stand around the pot with these European empires, the Native American figure is kind of being put on an equal playing field with them, which was a thing that was kind of an act of resistance by the American colonies, because the European empires wouldn't have wanted to envision the early United States as being like on the same level with them culturally or militarily.
So there's a metaphor of the common pot in terms of the book. Is it meant to point towards the cooking pot or the chamber pot?
Actually, I think it's kind of like the cooking pot some, but it's actually kind of somewhat geographical about the way that like the different valleys in the area were viewed as almost like kind of like containers for the
Mm.
people, and in the way that it kind of united them.
And would this be connected to the idea of the melting pot, or is that a later thing?
Actually, totally separate.
Okay.
I think melting pot is definitely a later thing. Yeah.
Okay, so we're back here for session 2, and we're jumping in to the second shelf here now. And so is there a book here you'd like to get started with?
Um,
This first one here, being logical, looks interesting.
yeah, that's a very I wanted to get some basic books on logic and its value in our current society, and that's just a really basic book about logic.
Okay.
Um, so much of what we're consuming now is like deliberately made to emotionally, like, really bring up a lot of emotions and manipulate those emotions. And we're living in a time where more and more, I think we need to spend a little time thinking about logic, just to keep an eye on ourselves and our brains. We're being led to think a lot of things by all the video and images we consume, and our brain is reacting in a way that's like completely natural to it. There's nothing necessarily wrong with all those emotions. It's just that they're not always serving our own best interest.
You've also got How to Think Like Shakespeare here.
Yeah. So that does seem kind of thematic with the other book, not in terms of logic, but just because it's about thinking. And Shakespeare and people of his day had just like a little bit more like a they were obviously like much less advanced in terms of sciences. So they just had a different kind of, in some ways, more holistic view of the world, a lot less compartmentalized.
Hmm.
Um, and it was also thinking about thinking in terms of like writing. And The Wasteland, I haven't read that book in a really long time, but when I was making the modernism video, uh, I I thought it would be cool to make a video about The Wasteland, so I got a copy of it. The Wasteland is a pretty hard poem. I feel like T.S. Eliot is probably like one of the most challenging poets. to follow. He's very dense, a lot of indeterminacy of meaning, and a lot of illusions. And he's very, very spiritual, which is something that we often don't equate with modernism, and we often, maybe we don't equate with that as much in our current world. So it's intriguing to me in that way.
Do you think he's sort of a transitionary figure?
I don't know. I think he's bigger than that in a certain way. I think there's ways that he's trying to in terms of form, he's really trying to advance modernist principles, but he's really trying to work out ways to keep close to his faith,
Mhm.
where a lot of modernist writers just accepted uh, the Nietzschean quote that God is dead and God wasn't here anymore. T.S. Eliot was trying to find ways to stay close to God in a world that he felt like was materialistic and often separated us from God.
Mhm. Are there any commentaries or intros that you like or you have later on?
Um,
Or
I'm not
otherwise,
sure I understand what you mean.
just in terms of, you said it's very difficult, and so if people want some help getting into.
Oh, well, the way I relate to it most is through the second chapter of The Great Gatsby. That's the chapter where Tom and Myrtle and Nick, well, Tom and Nick drive through the Valley of the Ashes to the train station, and that's where he meets George Wilson and Myrtle Wilson. That's Tom's mistress, and they live in a place that's kind of like the equivalent of the wasteland in the poem by T.S. Eliot. So I think that's an interesting way to connect to it if you want to connect with it, like kind of like with the vibe and with the idea of it, but where the actual poetry might be dense. And I've got a copy of the Tender is the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald to go along with my copy of The Great Gatsby in French, both of which I cannot read. I'm only on level 10 on Duolingo on French, so I'm gonna be working toward that one a little bit more. But it's interesting to me to think about reading F. Scott Fitzgerald in French, just because he spent so much time in France with other American writers, and because those years were so influential to him in terms of developing his style. I guess it's sentimental on my part. This Fahrenheit 51, really weird book. I'm not sure how many of our viewers have actually read that book, but one thing that I connect with a lot is the way that that narrator, he's got a really he's kind of estranged from his wife, and his wife spends all day in a room full of what seems like screens. It seems like all the four walls of her room are screens. And when the man comes home, she's not really able to describe what was going on in the screens to him. It's like she's so stuck in the context of those screens that she's unable to relate to people who aren't part of that screen world. And I don't know, makes me think about our phones. Uh, if we like, my students have this thing called brain rot, and it's where it's where, like, I think their thinking is, like, oversimplified by the phrases that they repeat over and over, and, I don't know. I make a connection there
Yeah.
because, yeah, I don't know. We have more and more screens in more and more places. got my several copies of The Scarlet Letter, got my several copies of House of the Seven Gables. Common Sense, that's a book that my dissertation advisor wrote about common sense. It's like a special edition. Broadview is another good publisher of academic books that are pretty good and are not like overly intellectual in like an abstract way, but tend to package it with a lot of historical documents.
Hmm.
Yeah, Common Sense, very, very complex, long essay by Thomas Paine, and Red Badge of Courage, really underrated American novel. I think that's a realist novel. It's written in the realist period, but that's one that is really kind of almost bridging the gap to modernism
So
a
what would
lot.
that period be? What decades?
So the realist period is in American literature. It's like 1865 to 1914-ish. It's like the Civil War to the World War One. And he's writing that book. I think he's writing it in the early 19th century, but it's set during the Civil War. And it's it's very much just like about the brutality of war and the chaos of war. Um It's really, like, anticipating a lot of the more, anti-war kind of literature, like, we might be more familiar with, like, with from the Vietnam War or something.
Are there one or two Vietnam era novels that spring to mind?
Um, the one that springs the mind the most to me is, The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. That's about a soldier who's, decides I think he's definitely in the East. I believe he's in Vietnam, and he decides he deserts and decides he's gonna go to Paris. And it's very much about the way, like, the objects are kind of, uh, taking on a lot of extra meaning to the people in it, because they're so disconnected and unmoored from most of what they know. My my my, my shelves are so disorganized that it seems like it's impossible to go through them without repetition, because if they were better organized, when we got to books like some of these, like, Common Sense, that would be organized better because it would be in with more stuff that was about, like, the revolutionary period of American literature, say. So, uh, it's just one thing that occurs to me as we go is that, like, some of these bottom ones, we'll get to, different kinds of books that probably could have been talked about along with Common Sense. I'm not as good on my Greek literature as I'd like to be. Um, my friend Slim Whitman read a lot of philosophy, and I don't know. I think, obviously the Greeks have so much to offer us. We often position them as like kind of like the forerunners of American democracy. So I guess just for intellectual reasons, and I'm drawn to it for that reason, even though so many of the ideas that we actually got from the Greeks really were transmitted to the Greeks from like countries like that we would locate cultures that we would locate in the Middle East now. And um, William Apis and Reservation Blues. It's kind of weird that I put those next to each other, just because they're both by important Native American writers, but widely different in time. Reservation Blues from Alexi. He would be, that's from like the 80s or 90s or something. And he Alexi would have been writing about a world that Apis he would have understood. It would have saddened him. Apis was a he was a Pequot writer speaking and writing in New England in the 1830s. So he was also a Methodist minister. He fought in the War of 1812. He was very much a civil rights activist for Native people and also African American people. He was fiercely abolitionist. He's a writer who I think that I think he should be read much more and talked about more, not only because of his civil rights thinking, but also just because his example like defies the way we think about indigenous people in the 1830s. He was very much living within uh, more American culture. He was more mainstream. He was speaking at the same kinds of places where Ralph Waldo Emerson would have been speaking, where Frederick Douglass would have been speaking.
Hmm. Like, what would that mean? What kind of
Well, like
places?
the Boston Athenaeum, for example. There was like the 1830s were like they were, especially in New England, were a period when American writers of all different kinds were trying to think about a whole bunch of new ideas, and they were interested in thinking about in new ways about America. One reason being that the United States got political independence in the 1776, right? But in terms of culture, uh, like it took a while in terms of trying to develop some ideas that were not uh, like directly tied to European ideas. Like Ralph Waldo Emerson in the 1830s, when he was writing, he was decrying that there hadn't been an American poet the way there was like somebody like Shakespeare, that America just didn't have that kind of history. Um,
I was thinking of the Chautauqua movement. I don't know if that's, I was looking up the years for that. It says 1874 to mid 1920s was the peak.
oh, what?
The Circuit Tent Chautauqua's movement.
Oh, right. So this would have been a little bit earlier than that,
Okay.
earlier than the peak, but it would have been starting to go then. Yeah.
I think I like to think about, what and you had the thinking like Shakespeare, how to think like Shakespeare earlier. I like to think about with YouTube, what were the historical analogs and the Boston Anatheum, if I'm saying that
Oh,
right.
yeah.
And the Chautauquas, those are kind of, if we were put in a time machine 200 years ago, that's where we would be participating in some way, either speaking or in the audience or something else. And and I think there's good stuff to learn from that. And even I was talking about this on another bookshelf tour about what predated um, Shakespeare, which was the morality plays, and Everyman was the most popular morality play, and that's now the Everyman book series and book library. So,
Hmm.
we've completely almost airbrushed out of history that period of pre-Shakespeare morality plays, which was sort of the teaching of Christian principles through the stage. And then Shakespeare was, arguably a transitionary figure um, to uh, a different way of thinking. Harold Bloom's, book on Shakespeare and the invention of the human. I think he sort of represents a paradigm shift there, but that's just, I don't know if you have any thoughts on in the American context or historically, those kind of circuits, those kind of places for the intelligentsia and people interested in ideas to meet and hear ideas and share ideas.
Um, Yeah, I think the Boston Athenaeum and that kind of circuit is a really good identification of that. These were people who were kind of experts in their own areas, but they were it's the way like our YouTube videos channel from screen to screen. They're kind of delivering something orally, the way we're delivering something orally, and they're trying to inspire people and educate people. Uh, yeah, I think that's an interesting parallel you're drawing. I'm a little bit interested in horror writing, so the Clive Barker, the Hellhound Heart, that kind of fits in with that genre. Uh, the book, I don't know, it's a little different than the movies. It's very good. It's quite good.
Is there a
The
particular period for horror that you're particularly interested in?
Uh, I guess I wouldn't say so. I guess I'd say I like horror from broadly different areas. Of course, you have to think about Edgar Allan Poe, and I think about like the earlier like the British Gothic traditions, uh, like the British Gothic novel. Those some of those novels were very voluminous and long, and then H.P. Lovecraft, even though uh he's not he's usually pretty low key racist, but he sometimes he gets a little high key racist, but uh he's also like a really interesting writer. Um but it's hard, it's hard not to like American writers just because they were racist, because then you wouldn't have anybody to like, really. It's kind of baked in, unfortunately. Jane Erotica is not that good, but I bought it for $1 in Dublin. Uh, but it's basically just Jane Eyre with some erotic escapades thrown in. And yeah, speaking of Gothic, these were like late Gothic novels, Emily Bronte and Jane Eyre. Not really horror, but they've got the vibe.
You're going to watch the movie, or have you watched the movie?
I haven't watched the movie, and I've only heard bad things about it.
Yeah.
I wasn't attracted to it, and I'm less attracted to it now. What about you?
Um, I'll probably like wait until I can like stream it and then watch the first 5 or 10 minutes and
Yeah,
go from there.
fair enough. Is that Charles Brockton Brown there? He's a Yeah, Charles Brockton Brown. He's the first that's the leftmost book, but he's like the first he's actually the first American novelist who managed to earn a living. And his writing also very gothic, very weird, very weird. He's got one book about us. He's got a couple of stuff where he's got sleepwalkers all over the place, and he's got one book set like during the yellow fever in Philadelphia. So just a lot of that claustrophobic vibe that we get from a lot of horror writers. He's very much writing in that tradition. He's trying to relocate the Gothic to the US the way that Poe, I guess Poe kind of maybe more successfully did. Uh, Albert Camus, uh, I've got a post for him in all my I use that as a background for a lot of my videos. He was a pretty important writer to me when I was like 18 and 19, and I return to him now and then. That
Sounds
period.
important.
Well, I think he's very much interested in finding ways to find meaning in worlds that seem like totally fallen and destroyed. So, this existential philosophy that he was working within with some other French writers like Jean-Paul Sartre, who was, it turns out by far he was considered, Sartre was considered like by far like the way more important philosopher. But in literary terms, Camus can be kind of inspiring in trying to find meaning in difficult circumstances, because he was writing during the German occupation of France. He stayed in France with Sartre. I mean, stayed in Paris with Sartre and some other writers when a lot of people had abandoned it. Heart of Darkness, interestingly, that's quoted. We were talking about T.S. Eliot. That's quoted in the beginning of The Hollow Men by T.S. Eliot. Um, Really interesting novel in terms of craftsmanship. It's just great. Um, it's like I think it's got like a triple narrative frame, which was part of something that started earlier, but often modernism, with its interest in unreliable narrators would have multiple frames. And it's also an important book in terms of like post-colonialism. Conrad was very much, he was very much important in terms of experimenting with modernist forms. He would be really influential to the development of the novel. But he was also exploring issues of like the dark side of the British Empire a little bit earlier than a lot of other writers were. I think I've got, if my bookshelf were better organized, I'd have a lot more James Fenimore Cooper there. Another early, really important novelist, kind of invented the Western. The Western, of course, is a TV genre, but this is very much, like the white person who's on the frontier. He becomes, very much like, a Native American person through his alliances through them with them, and it's a like, whereas, a lot of earlier works would have been, like, nervous about that on racial terms, Cooper's work is kind of celebrating like a white person who could kind of work between worlds in early America. And it doesn't mean that I think that he's a especially forward thinker in terms of race or anything, because I don't think he was. But we talked a little bit about the book "Playing Indian" by Philip Deloria last time we were on. We talked about like the Boston Tea Party, like white people dressing up like Indian people to try to assert a kind of identity, and I feel like that his works are often kind of in that vein.
Want to talk about the debate on the Constitution?
Well, those are just it's a collection of essays by James Madison and other writers about the Constitution. It outlines a lot of the thinking that the early, I guess we call them like the framers, were writing down to try to outline why they constructed that Constitution the way they did at a time like it was when it wasn't ratified yet. So it's actually been quite a while deep since I've dipped too deeply into it. Um, but those kinds of ideas are kind of important to return to in times when the meaning of what it means to be an American is kind of in question, and I feel like we're kind of in one of those periods right now. And uh, we really make a lot of references to the Constitution in our culture without necessarily understanding it or why it was created the way it was. Um, so I think it's valuable to return to now and then because the Constitution is kind of short, uh, and that book, as you can see, is kind of long. There's kind of a lot of thought put into the Constitution, even though it's short. By Bret Easton Ellis, The American Psycho. That's one of the books I've had the longest. Yeah, that and Less Than Zero. I've had those since I've had those Camus books since I was probably 18, and I probably had the Bret Easton Ellis since I was like 19. Um, he was at the time, I don't know, I felt like in a way he was kind of a modern, like a descendant of that Scott Fitzgerald in some ways with his use of a narrator, especially like in Less Than Zero. But the narrator who doesn't quite understand the world they're experiencing, and it's up to the reader to try to figure out that world. In The Great Gatsby, Nick Carraway is a character who is intimately involved in the action of the novel, but claims not to be involved in the action of the novel and not have any responsibility for what happens in it. And I don't know. I felt like Bret Easton Ellis was kind of writing in that tradition during.
You say a few words about Less Than Zero because I think everybody kind of knows American Psycho, but
Oh, so that's his first book. His second book, Rules of Attraction, also really good. But Less Than Zero, it's about a kind of a young man returning home for college, a man from a rich background, and trying to navigate the kind of materialistic and morally empty world of the rich in the East, in America. And it's it's pretty brutal in a lot of ways. It's really good. It's really short. There is a movie, and the movie definitely doesn't do it any justice.
Okay. Do you know where specifically it's set?
I believe it's New England, but I don't know specifically where in New England. I feel like it's like Connecticut or something.
Yeah.
Like these were people like with real money.
I was thinking of the
Erdrich,
Hamptons.
Louise Erdrich, probably maybe the most important living writer, uh,
Well,
Indigenous writer, obviously, but has a really large body of work and a big range of work too, like from short stories to poetry to science fiction. And yeah, I've got a few by her there, as you can see. The Roundhouse is one of her more recent books, and that's about a Native American attorney trying to figure out how to legally investigate a murder because the location of the body is in a place with so much overlapping jurisdictions because of the way that US Indian policy had tried to make it hard for indigenous people to investigate things like that. So it's kind of like a structural difficulty in the legal system that doesn't protect indigenous people. My William Faulkners, those are from I've had those a really long time since I was like probably 20. Those were the first books. Those for me kind of represented like a growth in my understanding of American literature. I hadn't read Faulkner before, and I hadn't read books that were so involved in trying to understand ideas of race in America. And of course, he's really interesting for the way he experimented with narrative form. As I lay dying, each chapter is from the point of view of a different character, and then so that at the time was kind of experimental. Sound and the Fury for its use of stream of consciousness, Absalom, similar way. I don't know why. I really don't know why my Nabokov is just in the middle there. But Nabokov, another just amazing novelist.
are there any particular narrative forms that you like or aspects of modernist experimentation that you think stand the test of time or you just particularly like?
I don't know. I have to admit, I really am interested. I really do enjoy it. The unreliable narrator, the narrator who is a part of the action that they're describing, but kind of disavows being a part of the action. That book, The Good Soldier, uh, is the first book I read like that. Uh, S. Scott Fitzgerald took a lot of his literary techniques from Ford Maddox Ford's The Good Soldier.
Can
And
you say
you can
just
kind of
what
see
The
it.
Good Soldier's about a little bit?
Yeah, well, it's interesting the way that The Great Gatsby, that's got starts with an article and then it's got a it's that's got a superlative, a great, and this has got a good. And then that's a Gatsby, and this is a soldier. It's about a person who in it was a really uh a great gentleman, and he was in terms of like British aristocracy, he had all the right he did all the right things. He was kind to his servants and kind to the people who worked on all his properties, and he'd fought in several British wars. But it's just as he was having having affairs with lots of women. So it's kind of about the way that in the narrator is really into this soldier, the same way that Nick Carraway is really into Gatsby. So I guess it's in some ways about how a person might have a lot of admirable qualities, but also be like totally terrible in some other ways. It's about like contradiction and tension between different sides of ourselves, and our abilities to do what is good, maybe what is known to be good or morally right, but and also like have failings and an ability to follow those things. Um, you find out at the end that one of the people who the title character is having an affair with is the narrator's wife. But that's information that maybe we could have used earlier in the novel. But this is held back. So I don't know. I guess novels to me that where the writer makes interesting decisions about the narrative structure in terms of like when they're going to reveal information to you. Um, I find those interesting. The Hemingway books, those I've probably had since I was like 15. Um, I like Hermann Hesse's work. The very really, obviously those are really spiritual works. Probably similar in terms of, I don't know, if I were to describe them, there would be ways that I feel like that would overlap with T.S. Eliot. It's just that T.S. Eliot was really focused on his Anglican faith, and Hermann Hesse was opening up to Buddhist and Hindu philosophies in terms of trying to find spiritual connections in the modern world. Shirley Jackson, we were talking about horror writers. She's really good. The most famous one is, of course, I think it's The Haunting of Hill House. Yeah, that's the most important. That's the most famous one. But another one that is really good is called We've Always Lived in the Castle. There was a Netflix version of that a few years back that didn't really do it the most justice. It wasn't a castle that they lived in. It was just like a rundown house. But it was a castle to them. Dysfunctional family.
I wanted to ask you briefly about this Foster book here.
Oh yeah, that book is awesome. It is so cool. So it's written, I think it's published in like 1783. So it's a very early novel. Just to give you like some perspective, it precedes Jane Austen by like 15 or 20 years. So, Jane Austen was very instrumental in terms of developing like the structure of the novel we have and understand now, where like the narrator kind of is not necessarily omniscient, but the narrator can move from like one narrative, one mind to another mind and entertain different perspectives. When Foster was writing that problem of being able how to incorporate different views hadn't really been solved. So the way that they wrote it was in the form of letters from one person to another. So it's very much in the vein of like Dangerous Liaisons, or the base predecessor to that would have been Clarissa, I think, by uh Samuel Richardson, which is just a lot longer version. But so it's kind of that same story. It's a romance novel. It's a novel about who you should marry and whether you should marry for love or some money. Those are very Jane Austen-y themes. It's just that that's a little bit later treatment of those themes, and it's a British treatment of those themes. But this is about a woman who she's young and she doesn't want to get married. And that's like creating a big problem for her. And she's socially ostracized for it. And she's pursued by different men. She's pursued by this like the safe man, and she's pursued by like the dangerous man. Those kinds of stereotypical characters. But she's very much trying to like assert a kind of independence outside of marriage, and ultimately it's kind of about the way that in that current structure of American society, there just wasn't any place for her.
Mhm.
It doesn't end well for her. And there's some debate about whether it's meant to be like a cautionary tale about what you shouldn't do as a woman. But really, I think it's more about like the failings of the society around her than the idea that it's a failing that she wanted to maintain her independence. Because, it's 1783. This idea of independence is kind of important then. You're not really going to be writing an anti-independence book in America in the 1780s. And there's very much a subtext there with the idea like she doesn't follow a lot of the advice that her mother is giving her. And even, shortly before then, when people thought about a mother, they often thought about Britain as like a mother country. That's one of the things that's one of the analogies that Thomas Paine was using in Common Sense, that Britain wasn't a good mother country, and that's one of the reasons why America should be able to be independent. So I like it the way that it's a really interesting attempt to write in a feminist way, but I also like the overlap with the political discourse.
I just put it into AI and it labeled it a post-revolutionary American sentimental novel. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on, the concept of a sentimental novel. Could you say a few words about that?
Well, that's very much the novel that I think I've tried to describe. I think I tried to describe that like Jane Austen is what we think of when we think about the sentimental novel. It's very much about it's trying to explore new ideas about feeling and emotion in worlds where like marriages were often arranged, and where there were often kind of rigid rules about like how a daughter should behave, and that she should always listen to her father. Even into adulthood, she should always listen to her father. It was about the on one hand, like the limitations of women in their society, and on the other hand, about the ways that women were feeling like an acknowledgement and celebration of emotions that women were feeling that maybe went against some of the ideas about the way women should behave.
Hmm.
And it like there's always a love triangle. Uh, the woman is always torn between whether she should marry for based on her emotion, or based on what her father tells her she should do, based on whether for love, or it should be money. Or the danger there is if you try to marry for love, if that doesn't work out, then the woman won't. She'll kind of already be like considered like maybe too old, or too experienced, or having too many relationships in order now to be valuable in that society to other men. So when I think about a sentimental novel, those are kinds of the things I think about. You can see I've got a lot of Herman Melville. I've got those Library of American Herman Melvilles. I've probably actually read almost all of those. He was really an interesting writer, and I think, he was like, the most experimental novelist, of the mid-19th century. I feel like, uh, Moby Dick for sure could have come out of the 1920s. That might be like for me, like the earliest, most innovative novel because of the way that it plays with form, and the way that it plays with plot and narrative structure. So many of the chapters, like a lot of the chapters in Moby Dick aren't really part of the plot. They're just kind of like the philosophical reflections about nature. And uh it starts out from a certain point of view of this character Ishmael, but as it moves on, you get different points of view. So it's shifting narrators a lot earlier than most novels, and then even some of the chapters in it have the structure of a drama, of a play. I guess it's probably really Shakespearean. I guess it's a tragedy in a lot of ways. I try to be a good patriot, so I've got my writings of Jefferson, just like I've got my debates on the Constitution. Jefferson, of course, his writings on separation of church and state, which he also, same with James Madison, who wrote some of those essays in the debates of the Constitution. But the separation between church and state uh, is something that is a little bit like misunderstood because there's so many people that think that like there's a specific religion that is or should be the primary religion in America, but the Constitution was developed in a way that was kind of like trying to prevent that. A lot of Jefferson's writings are interesting in that way. And his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, was an interesting attempt to kind of describe and catalog and categorize a lot of the geography of the US and different divisions within it. Uh, Taking a big, big leap of change. The Kerouacs were pretty important to me at one point in my life in college.
Yeah. On the
On
Road,
the
it's a
Road,
classic.
another novel that experimented with form a lot, very loose form in that, very influenced by jazz music.
Is this the one where he wrote the whole thing on a scroll and
Yeah,
with the typewriter?
yeah, yeah. I've actually seen that. I've seen that scroll like three separate times at three separate museums. It's
Yep.
quite a thing to see.
What does it look like?
It's just a really, really long piece of paper because he taped a bunch of pieces of paper together
Oh,
because he didn't want to stop. He felt like every time he had to take a piece of paper out of the typewriter and put another piece of the typewriter in, like it broke his rhythm. So it's different, you know. It's just like one. It doesn't have the same kind of breaks that you would think of in a novel because it all just kind of runs together. I guess like the modern day equivalent of like pageless Google Docs would have been appealing to him.
infinite
People have
scroll.
that. Yeah. Yeah.
That's sort of
I grew up.
tragic.
Hmm?
Sort of tragic also.
Kerouac?
On the Road.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Arthur Machen, he's a writer, British writer. You probably know him. A lot of people probably know him, but not everybody does, but he's a British writer experimenting in horror and weird fiction. Very much writing at the height of the British Empire. Somerset Maugham. He's another writer who is interested in Buddhism and Eastern religions. I guess I'm noticing as we go on across my bookshelf that I've got a lot of writers interested in that. Kerouac was interested in that. Herman Hesse was interested.
Maybe you'll do a debrief video on what you learned about your library after this comes out.
Yeah, I am learning a lot about myself. It's an interesting catalog of my intellectual commitments over the course of my life.
Blue Highways, wow. That actually, this was very influential on me. Going on this sort of shaped my travels around the country, and I bought a van and sort of bought a cargo van and turned it into sort of a camper in the back, and this and on the road. But I really like the idea of the Blue Highways, and it's cool to see this here.
I bought that in my the garage sale in my neighborhood for $1, and I haven't read it yet. But
Yeah, the Blue Highways is the concept of before the interstate highways. There were these smaller kind of, not necessarily one lane in each direction, but they sort of took you through the real towns, and whereas the interstate really tried to avoid population centers and sort of weave its way through. Although obviously it did bulldoze through some neighborhoods and cities and stuff like that. But the Blue Highways, what I liked about it is I was going to be able to see the real country, and not just, when you're on the interstates, it's just Walmart and then McDonald's, and then it's literally just sort of a whistle stop tour of the big franchises of America. Whereas the Blue Highways, I really saw like the devastation of Detroit, for example, and Appalachia, and that was very formative. So yeah, this was very influential on me.
Oh, that's cool. I'm glad that you stopped on that one and shared that one. Reading Lolita in Tehran, I have not read that at all, but I got it for the obvious connection to Nabokov. It seems apropos to maybe read that one kind of around now. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Again, noticing some patterns now, looking at these books with you. Another interest in Eastern ideas. Anne Radcliffe was a really influential British Gothic writer, writing in like 1780s or something, 1760s. I don't remember, but that's where the Gothic novel really had its zenith, was in writers like her. Season of Migration in the North is kind of like a post-colonial reply to The Stranger by Camus in my mind. It's from the point of view of African people. There's a lot of overlaps in terms of imagery. The imagery of like the sun, for example, that was so important in The Stranger by Camus. J.D. Salinger. I mentioned Mark Twain on the last one we did, as kind of a writer who I really admired, who has fallen like out of favor in our culture. And Salinger is another one. Really experimented with form a lot, and I think he deals with a lot of themes that we would consider American, like the quest for individual meaning and things like that. Shelley, another Gothic writer. The Last Man is a really interesting post-apocalyptic novel.
You mentioned epistolary format earlier, and I was thinking of this, but this actually came after the one you were talking about.
Right. Yeah, when Shelley's writing, the epistolary novel is actually, not as, it's early enough in the novel that there were still epistolary stuff going on, but yeah, it's post Jane Austen.
Foster's Coquette, we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing how young she was when she came up with that concept.
Yeah. Agreed. It's a really amazing novel. I'm also noticing a lot of stuff with water in oceans, like the Stevenson's South Sea Tales. I've got Robinson Crusoe. I've got Gulliver's Travel. I've got Utopia. Um, I guess the sea's kind of a metaphor.
For emotion.
Yeah, in the unknown.
I was thinking with Gothic, it's sort of part of Romanticism and sentimental novel as well.
Yeah,
Interiority.
definitely. Eudora Welty is a writer who's writing around the same time as Hawthorne, a very prolific writer, also experimenting with form. The Golden Apples is, I think it's like, it has a lot of allusions to the Odyssey in it. I think the Golden Apples are part of the Odyssey somewhere. That's a writer who I would like to study in more depth. Virginia Woolf, of course, important modernist writer, influenced Faulkner quite a bit. And then I've got all these works that were written like during the height of the British Empire, like The Island of Dr. Moreau or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Um, those are kind of they're early science fiction novels, so they're kind of interesting that way. But they're also interesting, like they're the way they're trying to contend with this idea of like the monstrous other and to what extent that monstrous other could be controlled.
Did you talk about this one, The Island of Dr. Moreau?
So, uh, in that book, uh, the main character, uh, ends up, going to, uh, I think there's several books in this series about Dr. Moreau. I don't remember, but it's about, so Dr. Moreau is, it's this book is a little anxious about science because this particular doctor is trying to create the perfect beasts by trying to combine animals with each other. So there's like an anxiety about science there because he doesn't really improve any of the animals. They can't function. But there's also maybe an anxiety about like racial purity also in the novel.
100 hair-raising horror stories.
Yeah, that's another book I got for like $1, I think.
Okay, so now we're moving.
Yeah, now we're actually to the final bookshelf, the short bookshelf. So at the top I've got my aspirational, I'm trying to read French and Spanish books. I don't know, I'm trying. There's nothing wrong with that. And uh
This book on the right looks interesting, From Puritanism to Postmodernism.
Yeah, I'd say it quite is. It's very much so. It's trying to write a literary history of United States literature.
Mm.
It's from the 1990s, so it's really quite dated in a lot of ways. But if you're interested in reading a lot about a lot of books and a lot of writers that you've never heard of in American literature, then that book is definitely for you. Uh, Like there's so much beyond what we generally considered the canon. And as you can tell, like these canonical writers are important to me, like Melville, for example, or Hawthorne. They do matter. They do definitely matter for me. Not only, but a lot of those writers were like more influential, like later, like say Melville wasn't successful as a writer, really. We appreciate him more now, and say I'm interested in him for his influence on, say, like William Faulkner. Uh, a lot of these books, a lot of the works that you would encounter in this book, From Puritan to Postmodernism, would be a lot of times those are works that were more popular during their time. And so they were more influential on the literature like of their own time versus like say Melville, who was more influential like 70 years later.
Mm. Did you like this book history intro?
Yeah, I did quite like that. And it was a book that was important to me during my graduate studies because I was like a lot of other people, I was interested in the ways that print circulated during the different periods that of like say like print technology was changing at the same time that like literary structures were changing. So it's interesting to think of them together.
How do you think about like different levels of culture, like high culture versus low culture in terms of print?
Well, like I think there is a difference, but it's not always like as rigid as we tend to think of it. And it's not like like for example, like Lovecraft, his writing, his weird fiction, I guess that wouldn't be have really been considered high culture, but it's also narratively complex. Like Moby Dick, that's considered high culture. It is narratively complex, but like
I
I
think
feel
it's
like the
Wayne.
Twain,
Yeah, it's like lower.
Mark Twain.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. I usually think of him as high culture.
But he was being read by
Yeah, like Tom
broad
Sawyer. Yeah,
swaths.
you're right. Yeah. There are times when it's really beneficial when the writer who we think of as a great novelist was also read during his day. And I think that now we look back and say Huckleberry Finn was like his greatest novel, but during his day, it would have been something like Tom Sawyer or something like that, which is almost like a children's book.
Yeah, I was thinking of I did another bookshelf tour where the guy had a big Roald Dahl collection, and I don't know, for some reason I see a connection almost there with Twain and Roald Dahl. Not sure why.
I actually don't really know that much about that writer, only through Wes Anderson movies.
Mhm. Some of the movies are pretty good. I think we were talking about Matilda, and I thought that was I have good memories. I don't remember almost anything of the movie, but um,
A lot of my 17 and 18-year-old students are more familiar with his writing than I am. So he must have
the
been,
artwork was really good also. Yeah,
yeah.
so distinctive, that sort of little bit sloppy kind of line drawing with watercolor, I think. Um, there's an artist in the New Yorker who has very Chaz, I think is the Might be able to look that up while we go, but this we're just talking about Romanticism. Here's the very short introduction. Those are usually pretty good.
Another subtext is Romantic writers. That period between like 1820 and 1860 in American literature was the time that a lot of the writers who we consider like uniquely American, like Henry David Thoreau or Herman Melville or Nathaniel Hawthorne were writing. And they were very interested in trying to like strive toward ideals. They were interested in trying to imagine like an America as they would like to see it. Like Walt Whitman was writing about an America that was in some ways like he was hoping for an America that was maybe more democratic than it actually was really during his time, but he was trying to imagine an America like that he felt like would be closest to its founding ideals, like one that valued people from all walks of life and all races and things like that.
So I've looked up the names of the two artists. Roz, R-O-Z, Chast, C-H-A-S-T, is one of the most recognizable cartoonists associated with The New Yorker, published continuously in The New Yorker since 1978. And I guess she illustrated an edition of Jane Austen. I just wrapped up doing a bookshelf tour with a woman who has a great Jane Austen collection, like multiple editions of everything, and she illustrated one of those. And then the other is Quentin Blake, who's the main illustrator of Roald Dahl. Also began illustrating his books in 1978. Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm getting is that Roald Dahl is kind of a recent writer compared to a lot of the stuff I've read. Is he writing in the 1970s, or are these like new editions? Is he like are these artists like adding art to newer editions that was not present in the originals?
I think so. Roz Chast is mostly New Yorker. I think that was and is her main thing. Quentin Blake he was born in 1932. Dahl was born in 1916 and died in 1990. So I think there was, Dahl's books illustrated by Blake, The Twits 1980, that's a lesser known. BFG 1982, that's a big one. Witches 1983, Matilda 1988. Matilda's a really big one. So, yeah, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory 1964.
I didn't realize he wrote all that stuff.
James and the Giant Peach 1961.
I didn't realize he wrote all that stuff at all.
I just hadn't thought of him much until that bookshelf tour, and it was like, wow, he really wrote a lot of classic children's literature.
I don't know why I have the life-changing magic of tidying up. I really don't, but it's there.
Marie Kondo.
Yeah. I know that was a big book a few years ago.
You've got several Ta-Nehisi quotes.
Yeah, the most I think I first got into him through he had an essay, I think it was in the Atlantic, called The Case for Reparations. And these other two books, one of those, Between the World and Me, it takes the shape of like a letter he's writing to his son about his understanding of racial struggle and his own experiences with that. And then the other book about civil rights struggle. I like him as an essayist. I like both him for like his style and also the way he structures an argument.
His father, Paul Coates, is the founder of Black Classic Press, an important independent publishing house specializing in Black history and radical political thought. Focus, reading here from AI, reprinting important works of African-American history, Black nationalism, and Pan-African thought. Has republished works by Marcus Garvey, Carter G. Woodson, John Edward Bruce, George James. Mission is to keep historically significant Black political and historical texts in print and accessible. He was a former member of the Black Panther Party, community organizer and activist in Baltimore. Major influence on Ta-Nehisi Coates' intellectual upbringing.
Wow, I didn't know that at all. That's really interesting.
When I was doing, one of the bonuses I give away for these bookshelf tours is the Harvard Classical, or the Harvard University Press classic library sets with the facing page translations. And I did a very deep dive on like what other classic sets are there. Not all of them are in facing page. And his came up in my research, Black classic books, just in terms of preserving, those classical works from the African-American tradition.
I think that's very cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Hoping to get him on the show at some point. I think it'd be cool to.
That would be amazing. Yeah. That would be a get.
Oxford Book of American Verse.
Yeah, that's a book that's interesting to me. One thing that I don't have that many here. I've got some on my bookshelf at school, but anthologies. Anthologies interest me because of the ways that they show what was considered important at the time it was published. So that's obviously a pretty old book. But that's another area, like we talked about that Puritan to Postmodernism book about the way that you'd find a lot of writers you've never heard of that were important. Same with there's a lot of pre-Walt Whitman American poetry, pre-Romanticism. It was very, it's not stylistically interesting to a lot of people because it's still like heroic couplets or attempts at Americans to write some kind of epic about America in like the early 1800s. I'm interested in these just for the kinds of ideas and myths they try to make about America. Like Joel Barlow he wrote an epic poem called The Columbiad, and it's all about he's making up stories about America's founding and kind of casting Columbus as kind of this heroic figure. And it's not true, but true doesn't matter when it comes to literature in a lot of ways, in terms of what lasts a lot of times. Like it's more about the ideas that are created and the concept itself that's important. Just in terms of like historical impact.
Huckleberry Finn kind of fits into that. Self-made man.
Indeed.
That's an area I'm particularly interested in terms of American studies. You have Horatio Alger's stories and all the way to 4-Hour Work Week and
so
modern productivity culture.
Ben Franklin seems to me to be the key figure there historically.
Yeah, what were his key works on that?
Well, his key, I think the one I'm thinking of that is, I'm sure is in that one it sure is in that one classic American autobiographies, is the autobiography of Ben Franklin.
Mhm. Poor Richard's
And
Almanac is also
yeah, but that's where he set up, he's got the tables of how he organized his day, and through discipline, he was improving himself, intellectually, and then he also had, like, a rigid work schedule.
yeah, I find him also interesting in terms of early secularization
Yeah.
and sort of he was influenced. I just put into AI. He was born 1706 in Boston to a Puritan Congregationalist family. Josiah Franklin, his father, was a devout Protestant. Originally intended him to be a minister. He gradually moved towards religious skepticism and deism. And I see him as sort of secularizing a lot of the ideas and ways of living from that religious era. And over time, it becomes difficult to maintain that. Um, so I see him as sort of a transitionary figure. And I also pulled up his 13 virtues, which you alluded to: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. It's almost like a secular monk.
Yeah, that is what I was thinking as you were reading those. They're just not, like, biblically justified,
Rule of St.
but they're still, like, rules we should follow or try to follow.
12 Rules of Life, Jordan
Yeah.
Peterson. One short.
Right.
Um, the Erotic Spirit, Shambhala. I think this might be the first Shambhala we've seen. They publish
Yeah,
Ken Wilber stuff.
my wife gave that to me early on in our relationship, as one does early in a relationship when, uh, there's a certain time in a relationship. But I am not that familiar with that writer besides that book. Another anthology, though.
Yeah.
Another anthology. A lot of anthologies.
We didn't talk about it, but I also noticed there was the last book here was popular fiction by women, 1660 to 1730. Any like interesting ones that you can think of from that era? Because that's early.
Yeah, I know. So, it's quite early, and those were writers who were trying to figure out how to write a novel. So in terms they end up being like they're interesting, like, they're very much trying to blend, like, earlier blend, like, a picaresque with a larger narrative form. A picaresque was a structure that, like, say this was, like, so this is an attempt at a novel that is even like, epistolary. So the picaresque was just a very episodic kind of novel with a whole lot of adventures that were kind of connected, just in terms of, like, they happen one after another, so they're sequential that way, but they're not necessarily connected narratively in the way that you think, like, the story, the events and that in an earlier part of a novel should be connected to a later part of a novel. They're just, like, not as unified in terms of, like, theme or structure. Um but these earlier women writers were, even if they weren't as successful in terms of trying to create a unified form, they were still really important to, like, the overall development of it, because they were trying things out, and later writers could see what failed and what succeeded.
So you've got classic American autobiographies. That looks interesting. You were talking about Ben Franklin.
Yeah, Ben Franklin's in there. Frederick Douglass is in there.
Hmm.
I don't remember who else is in there.
I remember something about Frederick Douglass and like how he would go. We were talking about the ocean earlier, water, and he would, I think part of his journey was near the water and was like, that's part of how we learned to read or how we learned.
Yeah, in Baltimore.
Mhm.
In Baltimore, he worked in the shipyards, and he also he would learn to read from some kids who were younger than him. But they were white, so they had been taught to read. But for him and for a lot of enslaved people, it was actually illegal for them to learn to read in the South.
And who was the woman who she was teaching him to read, and then the husband kind of shut that down?
Yeah, I think her name was Mrs. He calls them Mr. and Mrs. Auld, Auld.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that's one of the times in the book where he makes an argument that slavery is not just bad for African American people, but for white people too, because it corrupts them and makes them worse. And because for that particular couple who he was being, because he was owned always by the same person for most of it, but they would that this person would ship him to different family members. But anyway, she starts out being fairly kind, and she wants to educate him and help him. But her husband convinces her that it's against the law and it's dangerous, and she gradually becomes more cruel. I never played any card games with that Southwest Birds deck, but I still aspire to. These copies of Bancroft were from, I bought those from the Smithsonian American Art Museum for probably like 40 or $20 or something. But Bancroft was, for a time there, the writing of American history as a genre was considered an even higher literary form. If we talk about higher versus low culture, it was considered even a higher literary form than the novel. And George Bancroft was one of the like key, like loftiest figures in American history writing. Um, it's interesting to me, not for just like some other things, like it's not interesting for whether it's true or not. It's interested in the ideas about America that it tends to create. Just it's just some of this early stuff that makes the Puritans the heroes, and it's pretty safe in terms of when you think about American ideas, especially like when if you're thinking about a time when white people were still some of the main well, white people are a dominant historical class, obviously, but even like to a greater extent, it's very safe in the ideas that white people would want to hear about America. It definitely minimizes slavery. It definitely it contributes to the idea of a pure white ethno state in the United States. Um, but um, also narratively, it's a really ambitious project in terms of trying to tell a history of the United States. But he's really only even trying to write up to 1820. So you'll learn a lot of things that you wouldn't learn later, things that were important to intellectuals in 1820 or 1830.
Made me think of when you're talking about um, high culture, Terry Eagleton, the famous Marxist literary
Yeah.
critic and theorist, and has a really famous book, Literary Theory and Introduction, 1983. And
I think he was the one who talked about there isn't a stable definition of literature, and it's talks about a framework of literature as a reading from AI here. Literature is text privileged by cultural institutions dominated by particular social classes. And so we tend to think of literature today as like novels, but and maybe poetry, but it can also encompass, or historically and certain understandings of literature would encompass something like this history, which we wouldn't
Yeah,
really think of literature today.
right. Or like those
Narrative
morality
history is
plays
getting
we're
more
talking
popular.
about.
Sorry, what was that?
I was going to say, or like those morality plays you were mentioning. Like there was a time when drama was literature and everything else was kind of not.
Wow. I mean, I guess in a certain way, I think of there's a reverse to that, which not necessarily disagreeing with what you're saying, but like the way that we think of plays as something to be read and Shakespeare as something to be read, whereas that's really, these things were barely written down, and we have to like reconstruct the folios from all these different things because they were really meant to be performed. And so the whole idea of reading Shakespeare and like maybe you see it afterwards or maybe you watch it, a movie of it afterwards or in conjunction, that's taking it out of its original kind of intended form. And similarly with poetry, like the idea of reading poetry as opposed to listening to it.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking like the 1750s or the 1700s is when drama and poetry would have been like the only literary forms for a lot of people in England, and they would have been reading Shakespeare then. But I think you're definitely right that it's kind of an ahistorical way to look at Shakespeare in a sense that it doesn't match the view of his work during his own time. Probably right.
So
Because in the 1750s, they're viewing that as like high culture, whereas in like the 1500s, it wouldn't necessarily have been viewed as that.
and he was even sort of performing for the Queen and getting commissioned.
Yeah, he was.
So that's sort of the highest culture is even getting co-opted potentially.
I have to admit to not being a Shakespeare expert at all.
I was just thinking of the Aeneid and how that also, it has a political purpose and has to kind of navigate within certain guardrails. But I wanted to ask you, like, in terms of when does that change? Like you're saying 1750s, but when does literature narrow down?
To like the novel?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's got to be the 1800s. And like I don't know. I know that I think that I think that like the first like novels that we would consider like uniquely American would be James Hunter Cooper's novels. I think that that's when the novel is definitely at a high elevated form, and it's a person trying to write like an American novel. He's in a way he's like recreating Walter Scott's kind of structures, but he's kind of transplanting them and kind of changing them in a way that he thinks is suited to America and American identity. Um, so, but in terms of when the novel starts to be like a form of high culture, it seems like it's 1850s or something. But then a lot of our ideas of what is classic about American literature or what our best American novels are, those ideas don't come out, don't really fit, like, because like say Moby Dick, it sold, I think, like maybe 500 copies in Melville's lifetime. But during the Cold War, after World War II, a lot of critics and people at university were trying to create this idea of American literature and kind of canonize it and make it a patriotic thing. So some of those ideas don't come until later.
That's kind of, I haven't spent as much time as I want to on it, but comparing the Harvard classics, which are like the early 1900s, and that's when the curriculum at Harvard goes from classical languages to more like
Oh,
the
wow.
industrial turn and moving towards the elective system under President Eliot in his like 50-year reign. So he was really taking that curriculum and putting it into the Harvard classics. And then when you have the great books of the Western world, which is Mortimer J. Adler, that's decades later. And so you have sort of two different eras of forming a canon. And then there was a second edition around the 90s that brought in more of the 20th century because it ended at Freud. The first edition of Great Books of the Western World ended at Freud,
Interesting.
who was kind of straddled those 2 centuries.
All right. So,
Where should we get started in the shelf?
well, I think the shelf has actually, it's not surprising because so many of my shelves have cool books. But this book has some pretty cool. The shelf has some pretty cool books because this book, The Peabody Sisters, is about. Well, I've been told, and I can't verify this because I haven't read every autobiography of Nathaniel Hawthorne, but I've been told that this is actually the best book that works as an autobiography of Nathaniel Hawthorne because it focuses on uh, his wife and her sisters, and one of whom was a major publisher in New England. So it's one of those books that uh, kind of shows the influence of the women around a male writer in a way. So it's interesting in kind of tracing an American intellectual history. We've part of I think that part of the cultural work of that post World War II period had to do with kind of like developing this idea of the male genius writer like Herman Melville or Nathaniel Hawthorne. But really, some of these writers, like no ideas come out of thin air, and all writers are interacting with the world around them and taking ideas from the world around them, and one of those sources of ideas just often happens to be their wives. Uh, so, like F. Scott Fitzgerald, a lot of his writing, a lot of his first book was taken like exactly from Zelda's journals. Emerson, he took a lot of ideas from his mom. And Hawthorne got a lot of influence from his wife and her sisters. This book, White Silence, is about American sculptors, expatriate sculptors in Rome and Florence who were they were like they were employing neoclassical forms to try to create these sculptural myths about America, try to like put in narrative form uh, ideas that would normally like go in a novel or tell a story about America, but they were trying to recast it in the traditional neoclassical forms of marble sculpture that we would associate with like the Romans or the Greeks. So it's kind of an attempt to uh, I guess it's kind of creating like a high culture of American sculpture where one didn't really exist before and have it tell uniquely American stories. And finally, this book, What God Hath Wrought, that is a really cool book about changes in American technology and politics in this period, 1815 to 1848, that I don't know, it's kind of a period in American history where it's between the Revolution and the Civil War. So we often think about some of these things, like the history of like compromise over slavery, for example, fits into our historical textbooks pretty interestingly. But it's also interested in like the changes in technology and the way those transformed American society. In this title, What God Hath Wrought, it's named after the first message that was sent via telegraph from Washington D.C. to Baltimore. And so it kind of emphasizes like how big of a deal these things that now when we look back at them, it's just like we've got the internet now, we've got streaming. So the telegraph doesn't seem as important, but it really contributed to the way that information could flow across great geographic distances. So it's thinking about things like the telegraph and the steam engine and the railroad and the ways that those were instrumental in U.S. continental expansion. Because during this period, the Louisiana Purchase had already happened, but like the conquest of the rest of the continental United States happens during this period.
And what hath God wrought is a reference to the Bible, Numbers 23:23, from the King James Version. Surely there is no enchantment against Jacob. According to this time, it shall be said of Jacob and of Israel, what hath God wrought?
Yeah,
Um,
well done.
I was going to ask you about your interest in sculpture. Do you have any particularly favorite sculptors?
Yeah, well, the Horatio Greenough is kind of like probably one of the most important ones, and he's got a sculpture at the Smithsonian American Art Museum called "The Last of the Tribes," and it's the last of the tribes is obviously a Native American person. So it's participating in this kind of myth making about indigenous peoples as being something that was noble about America and had to be preserved before it was lost. So it's romanticizing indigenous peoples at the same time that it is kind of participating in kind of an intellectual acceptance and an act of genocide toward them. And that to me was one of the most important narratives of this early period in America, was this idea that Native Americans were a people that were consigned to the past, and with the progress of civilization, they just like couldn't survive. Uh, it's something that shows up in a lot of different American novels. I guess Last of the Mohicans being one of the most famous ones. Um, this shelf, well, it's got two biographies of Nathaniel Hawthorne. I mentioned him, and it's got two really, to me, that are very like important kinds of American things, which are the Salem witch trials and the Indian captivity narrative. The Indian captivity narrative, this book Captives, and this other some of the other books are the Indian captivity narrative is like the first uniquely American genre that tells the story, usually written by white women about their captivity by Native American people. And then I've at different points gone through periods of fascination with the Salem witch trials. And not only just like the historical event, but the way we write about them and the way we remember them.
Have you ever looked at, I think it was Cotton Mather's book?
Yeah, I'd say I'd looked at it. Uh, Wonders of the Invisible World is probably the one that's most important when it comes just about witchcraft. Is that the one you're thinking of?
Yeah, I was blanking on the title of it. Um,
Yeah, that's a really interesting book in the sense that he's trying to write about the Salem witch trials in a way that validates them at a time when they'd already been discredited. So he's really trying to perform like a lot of intellectual gymnastics in that book to justify the use of spectral evidence. And the spectral evidence was the whole thing that separated the Salem witch trials from all the other witch trials in the history of witch trials that were before it, because spectral evidence was the evidence that could only be seen by the accuser. But the Salem, there was always the idea that the witches could appear in forms and torment people in ways that were invisible to others. But this was the first time that that kind of experience was accepted as evidence in a legal court.
I don't know if you would connect it to the idea of like a moral panic or the various moral panics that have happened in American history.
I'd say it was a panic. Yeah. What other ones are you thinking of?
Well, I think I've gotten interested in and another connection here is the sort of theory of conspiracy theories. It's sort of a new academic field in the last couple decades, and it looks at like what exactly are conspiracy theories? What is the milieu? You know, that you have this whole Q thing, which I think um, has been kind of a big question in terms of what exactly is it, and you know, you mentioned earlier about how uh, I think it was actually the first book, thinking logically or being logical,
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
and just sort of romantic notions and emotionalism um, and and so what exactly is it that characterizes conspiracy theory, and what are some of the how do these different kind of tropes migrate around and kind of resurface in various conspiracy theories and uh, maybe give access to the zeitgeist, or they're part of the zeitgeist, they're part of an undercurrent, they're part of high-low culture,
Yeah.
sort of popular conspiracy, for example, versus maybe there is something about conspiracy theories as literature, as folklore, I guess. And so it just brings together a lot of interesting stuff. And I think there is maybe a class element to some conspiracies about people from below kind of criticizing elites or people above and how they conceptualize that. So it brings a lot of stuff together, and various politicians have sometimes found, and other people have found ways to sort of harness that energy towards their ends.
Yeah. I can see that. Yeah, they definitely believed in conspiracy. They knew who it was led by. It was the devil, but
Mm.
they didn't always know who was involved in the conspiracy. And I guess that's part of making meaning in a conspiracy is declaring who's part of the conspiracy and who's against society. And then that could authorize certain actions.
I think the Book of Job
has kind of an interesting frame narrative that gets at that. I did a tour with a pastor where we talked about providential theories of history, um, and I think the Book of Job really captures. There's the poster. We should get to that next, but um, just captures what that providential theory is and how God or the devil could act in the world. And they're just the whole history of sort of, or even the prehistory of conspiracy theory within medieval Europe, and just there's just so much there. It's kind of too much to really fully understand, but kind of our symbol systems to a certain extent rest on that folklore, and folklore, that's another thing that isn't really considered literature. More recently, it's been maybe started to enter into the canon.
Yeah.
The Brothers Grimm famously collecting folklore and then that making its way into Disney movies is an example of
Right.
that. So, yeah. Do you want to say anything about this poster here?
Um, so the myth of Sisyphus, some people it's probably pretty basic, but some people might not know. It's a famous essay by Camus, and it's comparing man's uh position to that of this mythological character named Sisyphus, who the gods get really mad at him, and he's content to roll a ball up a mountain, and then at the end of the day, it always rolls down. The next day, he has to roll it back up. But he compares that to being like the situation of man, where man has to keep trying to do these same tasks over and over and try to create meaning over and over, even though meaning just falls apart at the end of the day after trying to do it again. His argument. That's part of the situation of man, and that's one of the challenges of existence, is trying to keep making meaning in a world that works against meaning. I mentioned the way that book history was important to some of my intellectual commitments when I was getting my dissertation. So these were the two books, Volume 1 and Volume 2 of the History of the Book of America. They're two really monumental studies done by University of North Carolina Press in like the early 2000s that were trying to bring together a lot of scholars' expertise and their essays on the ways that print and book history changed over time, and the way that they also changed like society. Ben Franklin's a major character in that volume 1. There's a whole chapter about him and his escapades as a printer, because he worked in his brother's printing shop. And he eventually had to start his own printing shop, and that's why he moved from Boston to Philadelphia. It was because there wasn't enough room in the Boston market. So he's of course pretty pivotal in the history of Philadelphia.
I always thought of him
So
sort of his parallel with Einstein being in the patent office, and like, I think that the experience of just seeing so much intellectual work and creativity flow across your desk
yeah.
has some kind of impact where you feel like, hey, I could do that too. And then you um, give it a try.
And that's exactly what he did, because he was a printer before he was a writer.
And he was actually sneaking in like anonymous
Yeah.
articles.
Yeah, he was sneaking anonymous things into his brother's newspaper because he knew his brother wouldn't publish his work.
And do you remember how he signed it off? Was it like, there's something funny about that?
I don't remember, but I also do remember there was something.
Might be able to find that
Yeah.
more
Oh,
malleable.
this monumental 2-volume biography of Herman Melville. Ashamed to say I haven't. That's also something I've had that for a little bit. Actually, one of my close friends who named Brett Birkenbein. He was a close friend of mine. We were both getting our masters at the University of Houston at the same time. That's when I read a lot of Herman Melville and thought about Herman Melville a lot. He gave me that 2-volume biography. And The Good Soldier, that's the second edition that you'll see of that book. I mentioned the way that book was really important to me, thinking about the novel and unreliable narrators. My best friend Slim Whitman gave that book to me when I went back to grad school. So it's meaningful for that way. It was a gesture of support on his part. Because I was leaving a career where there was some financial stability in doing, I gave up all my income, all my means of income at the time, really.
You
to
connect
do
that to The Great Gatsby?
I guess, you know what? I guess, I'm just like, I don't know. There is an element there. It could be romanticized into building yourself up from the bottom again, I guess.
Yeah, that makes me want to check out this book. And like I said, I'm interested in that self-made man aspect of American studies. And this looks like part of maybe, I mean, the history goes back, but I
Yeah.
wasn't familiar with that piece of it.
This book about the Shawnee brothers who defined a nation. Who's the main? Oh, I think Pontiac is the main one I'm interested in there. But and then this book, Emblems of American Community, was really important for one part of my dissertation, the part that was studying the way that Europeans used the figure of the Indian to symbolize America in political prints. And then finally, the importance of feeling English. That book was by the outside reader of my dissertation, Leonard Tennenhouse. It was applying the diasporic studies to the position of early Americans. It was somewhat controversial, his theory, because he was taking something that had been mostly developed to apply to like the Black diaspora and applying it to English people who were not, they weren't marginalized in the same way as African American people, but they thought of themselves as being marginalized in a way in comparison to the British metropole. So it's very, very much about identity formation among colonial groups.
Hmm. That's seems like a play on the importance of being earnest, Oscar Wilde.
I know. It definitely is. It has to be. Yeah. I'm not sure exactly why he chose that title. I'm not sure if it definitely is a play on that, but I
Makes me
don't
think,
know
yeah.
why. Beyond that.
I found the pseudonyms for Ben Franklin. The main one was Silence Dogood,
Oh, yeah.
and the persona was a middle-aged widow. The letters humorously criticized Harvard education, colonial politics, religious hypocrisy, and social pretension. He secretly slipped the letters under the newspaper office door so his brother James would publish them. And stuff has come out about President Trump, about his sort of pretending to be his own PR guy and calling the press and feeding them stuff. So I guess there's an interesting tradition there.
Yeah.
There were some other pseudonyms, actually. Richard Saunders, author of Poor Richard's Almanac, Busybody, Anthony Afterwit, and Alice Addertongue.
That's
So,
so funny.
yeah, there's one up top. I don't know if you have any thoughts. Portrait of a Lady.
It's a book, Henry James, obviously. It's obviously very long. It's one of those books that is just kind of important in American literature. Henry James trying to think about differences between Americans and English people and try to like kind of negotiate a place for an American identity within a more European identity. But also, it's a book interested, like say some other books I've got, like The Coquette, interested in like the limitations that our society tends to place on women in their roles in society.
So as we wrap up today, do you have any final thoughts on your library? And then we can get to, uh, you know, we can tell people a little bit about your channel and where are the best places to find you and learn more about you.
Well, I think what I've learned about the library is I've learned, for one thing, I tend to hold certain books from certain parts of my life. I've eschewed some other ones, but yeah, I'm definitely noticing some patterns here with my interest in authors who are also interested in Eastern religions, all these writers who experiment with different types of narrative forms. And finally, I mean, I knew that there was a definite through with race in American literature, and I guess our talk today and the last time kind of just kind of emphasized that for me. So many of these writers are trying to negotiate issues of race and national belonging. And finally, if you're interested in my channel, I'm on the YouTube, and I've historically, for most of the time that I've been working on my channel, I've been focusing a lot on teaching writing to a lot of my undergraduate and high school students. But I'm going to make more and more videos about literature and history of American literature on there. That's my goal right now.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for giving us this tour. And we look forward to seeing what everybody thinks down in the comments.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. And yeah, I'm interested in your comments as well, viewer.